This is Gender in Focus. I'm Elle, and each week I sit down with the president of Transfocus Consulting and all-round gender diversity genius, Kai Scott. I get to ask all the questions you've ever wanted to ask about how to make the workplace and the world a better place for trans and non-binary people. Let's get into it.
In today's episode, we are exploring the wonderful world of visuals. Images are a powerful way to convey humanity in all its rich diversity. However, trans and non-binary people often do not see themselves represented in visuals used in corporate communications. Similar to people of color or people with disabilities, they are often underrepresented or just simply overlooked on websites, brochures, reports, posters, and PowerPoints. How do we address this gap without resorting to stereotypes or overemphasizing struggles? We explore the nuances and considerations to help you and your organization source and use more inclusive imagery to represent the full spectrum of gender diversity in today's episode. And I'm really excited to be joined by my colleague Elle to sort these issues out.
Visuals are a really important one to get right, and since you've probably been dealing with this for quite a long time now, what would you say are some common mistakes that workplaces make when trying to get this right when it comes to including trans and non-binary people in their visuals?
Yes. So there's a lot of missteps coming from a good place. People are wanting to represent trans and non-binary folks, but unfortunately they resort to stereotypes. And this can often come with kind of an overemphasis on things like bodies. That's where a lot of cisgender people who tend to be sourcing the visuals tend to focus, right? So, okay, trans is about bodies and them changing and whatnot. Now, that's not always the case. For some, it is. For others, it isn't. And so people can resort to things like how somebody presents, maybe the clothing that they wear, but also, how people might be changing their bodies. It's typically like very dramatically, I find sometimes the representation of needles and scalpels and whatnot, which is very kind of in your face representation of the medical aspects of transition, which is, if people choose that aspect, a very short period of time, and then everything else is not that. And so it seems very odd to overfocus. Another one that I find is overused is this image of somebody looking in the mirror, presenting one way outside of the image and then another way in the image, and to represent the kind of two aspects of being visible and not visible and whatnot, and but very confusing for many because like which one is the right one, and and also very much resorting to the binary always, right? So always representing kind of men and women, masculine, feminine, but never the spectrum. So it's very difficult for non-binary folks to see themselves well represented. Another big one that we see a lot is the half man, half woman icon. And I'm like, hey, to suggest that there's actually two parts in every trans person, rather than just their actual gender identity.
Is that
Yeah.
in washrooms that you see that?
That comes up in washrooms, but also I'll see that in articles about trans people, and that's meant to kind of represent, one person having multiple aspects of themselves. Now, I will say, if there is somebody bi gender who identifies as a man and a woman, that might be suitable, right, for that one person. But as a way to represent all trans and non-binary folks, it's a definite miss,
Right.
because it doesn't land for everyone. But yes, definitely on washroom signage, people who think are trying to represent all genders will have a man, woman, and then this half man, half woman icon to represent trans and
Right.
non-binary folks. And it's just like many people in the community groan at that representation. Again, people are trying, but missing the mark in that regard.
So you talked about the kind of spectrum of different visuals. Can you go into that a little bit and just a bit more about how workplaces can explore that in their visuals and really represent everybody?
hmm Yeah, so I think many people assume that trans people all look a particular way, that there's one trans way to represent everything. And really, it's just a spectrum similar to cisgender people or non-trans people. They come in all shapes and sizes and forms and colors and whatnot. So, similarly, trans and non-binary folks will look many different ways. And so it's really just about making sure that there's a spectrum of gender expression. And that's a really important way to represent everyone. Is so it's not just very feminine and very masculine looking people, but it's actually a whole spectrum, including folks who are androgynous or who perhaps have a mixture of different feminine and masculine traits and ways of expressing themselves. Another really important way, especially if we're showcasing trans stories, is to ask folks if they feel comfortable to indicate that they're trans. So it's a visual of that person, maybe a photograph or an illustration that is then accompanied with a description that then showcases transness. And in that way, it's not stereotyping because this is someone's genuine expression and way of being in the world. And so that's a helpful way to make sure that there's a good representation. By virtue of a visual accompanied with a description, I always recommend that it's not just one representation, that there's a spectrum of different trans people illustrated, perhaps together, maybe enjoying, just any everyday activity that you can think of. And in that way, it really helps people to see that there's many different ways of being trans and non-binary,
Mhm.
and for some to be hopefully, as the reader, to be surprised, because oftentimes, for example, we expect non-binary people to always be androgynous when, as you very well know, is not the case, right? Uh, so it's making sure that people can see the full spectrum of both gender identities and gender expressions.
You just said something then that has been a topic of conversation that we've had before, which is about how a lot of visuals may be, well, you said this at the beginning, that overrepresentation, either the sort of medical aspect of transition, but also the struggle and the kind of
Mm.
negative aspects of that. And you just then mentioned about people just kind of living their lives and being trans and just kind of existing.
Mhm.
Um, could you go into that a little bit more and just talk about why seeing trans people just living life is important in visuals and just experiencing joy, especially?
Yeah, it seems so simple, but it actually is really important, because when I look at, stock photography, just to get a sense of what people, the kind of imagery that is put forward about trans and non-binary folks, typically I would probably imagine not a lot of involvement from trans and non-binary folks. It typically is, the medical piece, but then also the kind of protesting and, pushing back, which
Mhm.
is an important aspect to represent, because there's a lot happening these days where, unfortunately, trans and non-binary folks still have to fight for kind of basic
Mhm.
rights, basic, care, you name it. And so I think it is important, but if that's the only thing, unfortunately, it over indexes on struggle
Mhm.
versus, of course, trans people also, we just live our lives. And so, having people, together with folks, sharing a meal or walking or playing a game, or, just something very benign, very simple, to show not only one trans person, but as part of a community as
Mhm.
well, enjoying life, being a part of life, contributing to life, I think is really important. Sometimes what I found in the stock photography is that the trans or non-binary person is just solo against a beige background. I'm just like, that's
Right.
just so flat, right? Is like, of course, we're doing stuff out in the world, being a part of communities, being a part of families, friendship circles, and whatnot. And so that does a disservice to the fullness, the multidimensional aspects of being trans. And so having it with people is super important, colorful, full life. whatever that looks like, even the kind of simple stuff to the even more important things, giving speeches,
Mhm.
contributing to, thought leadership, whatever may be the case. But it's really important to draw out those, whether it's part of stock photography or images that you create with trans person that you're working with or trans
Mhm.
people. Yeah.
You mentioned about asking the people that you're taking a photo of whether they're comfortable with you sharing that they're
Mhm.
trans. And you've told me a story about yourself that
Yes.
is kind of related to this. So I was
Mhm.
wondering if you would mind sharing that.
Yes. So I was involved in a trans specific campaign
Uh-huh.
to highlight different experiences of trans folks within, let's keep it general. I don't want to specifically highlight this because I know this person meant well,
Hmm.
but unfortunately just didn't quite understand. And in this campaign, there were multiple people, and I think the person organizing was struggling with how it was going to be obvious to the other people, to the people looking at the campaign, that we were trans. Some people don't look obviously trans in the way that society expects, right?
Hmm.
And so, especially when it came to me, she was saying, well, how will people know? And part of me was like, well, just say it, right? Like that's,
Right.
and it's a part of a trans campaign to highlight a lack of inclusivity or struggles with accessing particular types of spaces. And so I thought that was sufficient. But then she went a step further and was like, well, what if you were in a swimming pool and you had your shirt off and you're in your swimming trunks, right? And then it would be really obvious in that way for the reader because I have surgery scars from top surgery, and then people would understand. Well, that kind of took me by surprise
Mm.
because, again, it's very kind of medically focused that people's understanding of transness comes from,
Hmm.
if they're not themselves trans or non binary or part of the community more generally. And so it felt very reductive
Hmm.
that my transness was only defined in terms of the surgeries that I've had, rather than being a full human being with many different aspects.
Hmm.
Certainly, surgery was very important to me, not to discount it, but that's not really the main thing.
Hmm.
And so it did take me aback, and it felt really gross,
Right.
like very prying. And I will say too that that does not guarantee people understand when they see surgery scars. I can say that because I've been in the pool and people have asked me about my scars and thought I had, lung cancer or something like that. The scars don't really guarantee understanding or seeing scars. And so again, it's just thinking about it. What is the trans person comfortable with?
Hmm.
Certainly, some people are excited to, after having top surgery, they want to, be shirtless and celebrate that aspect. So, absolutely, if they choose it, support it, if it makes sense, obviously. um, and also, if somebody doesn't lead with that, don't push somebody or even suggest that. I think
Hmm.
people just don't realize what they're asking for. And, thinking about the audience and connecting the dots, there are different ways of doing that. Certainly, sharing. One's identity is key to that,
Hmm.
or can be a part of that rather than, having to focus so much on the visual aspects.
Can I ask you, and you have already sort of gone into it a bit, but I just wanted to go further into the why behind not sharing things that
Mm,
are sort of over focusing on the medical aspect, because you've mentioned this a couple of times, and this is definitely something that most cis
mm,
people that I've spoken to about basically any trans issue,
mhm.
they leap to that quite quickly. And so, would you mind going into that a bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. There's many different dimensions of that, but I'll boil it down to a few things. One, the assumption is among most cisgender people that in order to be trans, there's some sort of medical transition. Like that's just built into their definition,
Hmm.
when in fact most don't. And so I think that's a bit surprising for folks.
Mhm.
Trans is just gender identity is different than sex. That's it. What somebody does about it, if they need to or feel compelled, that's up to them, right? It's a very individualized journey. Now, what I will say is that for up until fairly recently, in order to transition, there was a overemphasis on trans people becoming cis, so to speak, right?
Mhm.
That they align in term their gender to how their body looked. So having kind of almost forcing people into surgical or medical intervention, but also how they looked. I mean, until very recently, there was something called real lived experience. And I put that in very heavy quotes because people assumed that if you're a man, you're going to present or want to present in masculine ways and, dress in masculine, et cetera, et cetera.
Mhm.
And so in order to transition or to be oneself, these were some of the heavy gatekeeping and expectations and kind of forced alignment that people were compelled to do. And so it's a very visceral reaction to
Mhm.
any sort of um, preconceived notions of what somebody should or ought to do or have done or be doing in order to be their true selves. When in fact, especially also among cisgender people, just everybody comes in different shapes and sizes and expressions. And so just being able to relax those expectations is really key to allow people just to show up as they are, as they want to show other people, as much or as little, right?
Mhm.
To really come alongside rather than trying to impose something on top of the trans or non binary person.
Mhm. There are some real benefits of using illustrations over photos. And obviously, you've been talking
Mm,
predominantly about photos at the moment, but could you just go into that a little bit and how illustrations can really benefit workplaces when it comes to inclusive visuals?
absolutely. So I understand why people go to photographs, whether it's created themselves or stock photography. Uh, we like to see realistic representations of ourselves. Now, that said, stock photography still has a ways to go to really authentically, uniquely, and fulsomely displaying and
Mhm.
representing trans and non-binary folks. So we at Transfocus made a very intentional decision to use illustration rather than photography in our marketing and all what we do essentially, because it gives us a lot more latitude to create that diversity because it's not quite there yet in photography. It allows us to, represent not just gender identity or gender expression in a fulsome way, but also, color, skin color, disabilities, and create those in an intersectional way as well, right? So,
Mhm.
trans people with disabilities and, a vast variety of folks, so that we're not so. You know constrained or limited in what we can do. It really just is the imagination that is limiting. And
Mhm.
so we've tried our best. I'm sure we have still ways to go too. Um, we're not by any means the standard bearer here, but certainly, being a lot more creative in that representation is really important.
Amazing. What are your closing thoughts on inclusive visuals for people's workplaces, Kai?
So, we've given you some examples of what not to do, some tips and strategies for what to do. I think really important thing to add is if you are working with trans and non-binary folks to share their stories or to be a part of a campaign or whatever the case may be, is really important to take your time in getting to know somebody, seeing what their level of comfort is in sharing their story, in how they want to be depicted, and so just allow enough runway. Sometimes I find companies, they want to kind of get it done very quickly when this is a very sensitive matter for
Mhm.
many trans and non-binary folks, and making sure you have consent along the way, like who's going to see this, how far distributed, and whatnot. also to be able to offer many different ways of being represented. I know image is a very powerful thing. It does connect folks to each other, to see each other. But I would say that there's other different ways of doing that. So, people telling their story, maybe having a shot from behind if there's confidentiality considerations. So you really want to think through all of those options that you're able to make available to folks, or to have an illustration rather than a photo. Because right now, things are really difficult for trans and non-binary folks, and some people are pulling back from being highly visible. And so that's where it's really important to offer many different options to still be able to tell one story, but in a safe way. So I just kind of add a few of those tips and tools in there as well. But very much encourage to pivot away from particular bodies and or particular gender expressions for trans and non-binary folks, but really for everyone too, right? I know many cisgender people also kind of have that burden of expectation.
Mhm.
And what if we allowed everyone to kind of is a bit more relaxed so that they could feel like they could show up as their authentic selves and be represented in those images, and how powerful that is for the audience to see that as well, to be like, I never knew that this was possible, and maybe that resonates for them to do in their own lives. So it unlocks a lot for folks to see that,
Mhm.
whether it's for themselves or just so people know that there's this diversity that exists, even if it's not maybe directly in their own lives at present. And if I can say anything as a last note, I'm only laughing, but I've seen a lot of stock photography, and there's some pretty incredible, awful examples out there. I think you're laughing because you know what I'm going to say.
Yeah.
Um, the most ridiculous thing that I've ever seen is somebody. Uh, I don't know if they were shirtless. I can't remember. It doesn't matter. But in some level of undress, shall we say, in front of a mirror, shaving, and this person had a glitter beard. And I'm not saying no shade towards people with glitter beards. And if they have it, rock it. But more often than not, people don't have glitter beards. And but the other thing that just took it to the next level is this person looked really sad. So they were like mournfully shaving their glitter beard.
That's my favorite one. That's my favorite bit.
And I just, wow, I was like, wow, this
Mhm.
is, and this was tagged as a transgender picture, and I was like,
Mhm. Yeah.
we've got a ways to go here, folks. And so just say if you ever see that image, just steer very clear of that. That is not helpful representation, even if it might apply to one person or a few. Anywho, just to leave you with that kind of more lighthearted, but also a bit of a grimace. Uh, but there's many other things that are starting to develop, and there's a much more encouraging direction that inclusive imagery is going in. So I am quite hopeful, even if I shudder sometimes at some of the things I see.
That is one of my favorite ones that you've shown me. Um, but yeah, so visuals is something that we do talk quite a lot about in places like our social media, but
Mm,
also you do a lot of work with organizations around visuals, and one of the things you put together was the inclusive visuals
mhm.
document. Do you mind going into that?
Absolutely. So we get a lot of questions about, well, how do I do inclusive imagery
Mhm.
in organizations? And people want to do good by trans and non-binary folks. So we've put together, I think it's about an 8-page resource. So it's quite dense. Basically, the first part is like, don't do this. This is very reductive slash problematic, or just more like, kind of like, really, like one example is they them pronouns. That's a very popular one to say. This is a non-binary person, and maybe it fits in certain contexts, but most contexts, that's pretty reductive way to talk about non-binary folks as well. And so, what not to do. And then really, it's just a whole bunch of examples and points about how you can make something more inclusive and what makes it much more richer, much more diverse, much more exciting and engaging imagery that one can use, as well as links to stock photography that are created by trans people for trans people and that are free and available if you source properly. And so it's a great resource if you just want to kind of run with it essentially and make your organization's imagery more inclusive.
Amazing. Well, I will add that to the show notes. And like I said, we do share quite a lot about visuals on social media. So, in light of that, where can we find you, Kai?
So there's many different platforms that we're on in terms of social media, whether it be LinkedIn, Facebook, Threads, Blue Sky, YouTube, Instagram. I'm sure I'm missing one. Oh yeah, TikTok. So find us on any one of the platforms or multiple platforms and see some of the regular. We post, most about 5 times a week, so you'll get a lot of really good content that hopefully is engaging and you learn from and be able to implement, whether in your own personal life or also professionally at work.
Sweet. Thank you so much.
Thank you too. Bye for now.